Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to our webinar where we're going to be taking a look at proactive strategies for always on due diligence. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. All participants will be muted and the session is going to be recorded and will be available for on-demand playback later. You can ask questions at any time by typing them into the Ask a Question box below the slides view, and we'll look to answer those at the end of the webinar in a dedicated Q&A session. Okay, so on to introductions. I'm Neil Ishwood. I'm a subject matter expert and strategy leader within the third-party risk and compliance line of business here at Dun & Bradstreet. I've been working here for over 20 years, and I've originally focused in the technology arm, but have spent probably around a decade or so in our financial services vertical, working with clients mainly focused on AML and KYC integrations. But in the last couple of years, I've also been focused outside of the financial space and concentrating on the growing requirement for corporate businesses to conduct increased due diligence on their suppliers, partners, third parties, etc. I'm also going to be joined by my colleague Martin. I'll hand over to him to introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Neil. So hello everyone, my name is Martin Skeens. I'm a subject matter expert for our third-party risk and compliance division at Dun & Bradstreet. I've been with Dun & Bradstreet for about 9 years now, and prior to that I have 7 years experience in the business information sector. I am also involved with a lot of our product prioritization and design, and hopefully today we're able to really dig into this particular topic that I'm looking forward to discuss. With that, I'll pass over to Nikki to introduce herself.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Delighted to be here today. I'm Nikki Stoy. I have been with Certa for about 6 months now. I come from the GRC technology background. I've worked in the GRC space for, again, around 20 years. I've seen a lot of changes over that time. The last 3 years I've worked really in the third-party risk management space, and really what that has enabled me to do is bring together all of the different experiences across different risk domains, but really looking at the extended enterprise and how businesses can use technology to really enable those programs and really create efficiencies in their systems. So I'm really delighted to be here today alongside the Dun & Bradstreet team and looking forward to getting into the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. So in terms of the areas we're going to cover today, we have quite a packed agenda. So we're going to start off just defining and refreshing what perpetual or always on due diligence is. We'll also look at some of the advantages it can offer. We're also going to briefly dive into the potential ROI that you can achieve with it. And we'll also spend some time going through the foundational components that we believe you need to have in place to actually get to that endpoint. And we'll finally finish off with some Q&A where you can ask any questions you wish to the team. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Nikki now to kick us off around defining perpetual due diligence.
Thank you. Okay, so what we thought we would do is just really take a step back and really define what perpetual due diligence means in the context of our presentation today and in the wider kind of domain of third-party risk management. So really, if you think about that end-to-end third-party program of works and what really happens, due diligence really serves as a critical early step in that process. It involves thorough investigation of the third parties that you're going to be working with to identify and assess the various risks that they may pose to the business. And this could mean things like evaluating financial stability, operational capabilities, cybersecurity practices, their compliance with relevant laws and regulations, reputational factors. And equally, we think about third parties. They could be customers, they could be joint ventures, they could be direct suppliers to the business. You need to be able to understand also areas such as any PEP sanctions, UBOs that are what's really happening with that third party across all of those different kind of risk domains. So what you're able to do using specialist systems such as Dun & Bradstreet is really, we see when these programs work really well, is bringing the data into one system so that you then have that ability to enrich the vendor profile and that vendor or third party profile before you even go and speak with them. So based on the due diligence findings and being able to run that approach, you can then categorize and tier your third parties into whether they're high, medium, and low, and actually understand really which areas of risk they're going to bring to the business and how you are then going to engage with them. Okay, so moving into this next slide, what we're going to do is really look at how businesses are starting to adopt more of a rules-based dynamic assessment approach. So this really starts to lead into that kind of more perpetual due diligence approach. Typically, what you'll find in the traditional assessment approach is that a lot of the time, generic assessments are being sent out with lots of different questions that are not tailored to that third party. And what that does is then sets up a scenario where it becomes harder to get those completed assessments back. And the assessment fatigue when you speak to vendors that are on the other end and they're receiving lots of different assessments in lots of different formats and they're not necessarily relevant means that it starts to create a bottleneck in the system of getting those assessments back. So what a rules-based dynamic assessment approach does is it streamlines those processes. And this is where the technology really can come in as the enabler. So through having that framework that will support an inherent risk questionnaire process, what you can then do is trigger a workflow, which will then start to triage and send to that third party into a correct routing for the risk profile. So in the example you're seeing on the screen now is a business requester makes a request, and actually then an inherent risk questionnaire process happens. What the system can do is actually say, well, this third party is in scope for trade compliance, anti-bribery and corruption checks, AML, and start to really route and serve up the relevant processes, including scanning databases such as Dun & Bradstreet. And this means that they're very much then appropriately assessed. So what we're going to do now is really move into more of the perpetual KYC approach. What you're seeing on screen is an example of a typical periodic review approach. So what happens is, and in this example, you might have a number of customers that have come in, you're onboarding them. And actually, as the year goes on, they'll have different changes. It could be they have new directors, they have new UBOs, and they come up on an adverse media hit, or have changes in addresses or phone numbers, etc. But in a typical example, what happens is there's only an annual check on those customers, and you'll go back once a year, do the checks, and that's a wholesale review. So what we're really seeing as the way forward with the perpetual due diligence approach is, rather than on an annual basis going and engaging with those customers to find out if anything has changed, is having that ongoing continuous monitoring approach in your program. So as soon as there is a change, what happens is it will trigger the system to actually say there's been a change. I want the system to then alert the relevant business owner or risk owner, and go into the adjudication team. So it triggers a process which will then allow you to action and then clear these as they happen. So this really starts to mean that you've tightened up those risk management processes. You haven't got that 1-year review, but importantly, you're not having to review those that haven't had changes. So I'm going to hand over now to Martin, who can really dive more into the advantages of this approach.
Thanks very much, Nikki. As you can see from the slide that's about to appear on your screen, We have called out three main advantages of a perpetual KYC approach. The first being a faster reaction to risk. I'm sure that all of those on the call have encountered situations where they wish that they had just known of a risk that little bit sooner. In a fast-changing economy that we all live and work in, the impacts of not being aware of a risk sooner will only have bigger and more costly implications. This is particularly so with ever-increasing new and emerging threats. Being able to respond to them quickly will become essential. Capturing the right information is the next advantage, and Perpetual KYC advocates a data-led approach that encompasses any piece of data that can change your view of a particular risk. Combining internal data with external data ensures that you have the most comprehensive view. It might also be worthwhile noting that these individual pieces of information, or changes of information for that matter, may not be consequential in their own right, but when combined with other pieces of data, can lead to a far richer picture of risk. There are many systems on the market which companies like CERT offer, which can help with such a task of joining the dots where it might not be evident to begin with of a particular type of risk. Resource efficiency is also a key advantage, and the slide which Nikki presented on a moment ago summarized that nicely. That by responding only to changes that, as and when they happen, there is no need to expend energy on resources conducting a review or concluding that nothing has actually ultimately changed. This also allows for staff to spend time on higher value tasks rather than conducting repetitive tasks which could easily be automated. Hopefully, this also leads to greater staff satisfaction and retention. With ever increasing pressure to do more with less, this is also becoming an ever more important element in this process. I'll now pass over to Neil to discuss the ROI of a perpetual KYC methodology.
Thanks, Martin. So in a lot of conversations we've had with clients over the years who are looking to move to this continuous due diligence approach, they've often asked for more detail around the ROI achievable. And there's often still been questions around the approach. So one train of thought is, well, if we save up all those changes for a periodic review, then it's in one way efficient. And sometimes they're also worried if they switch on to this kind of live stream of changes as and when they happen. Some have been worried and say, what happens if this effectively overwhelms our operations? What if we get too many changes coming in? So to help answer some of those questions and flesh that out, we decided to do a detailed study, which we'll just touch on here. We won't go into the full depths of the statistics. But what we basically did is we took a look at the entire UK universe of registered companies, and we analysed 1 month's worth of changes across that entire spectrum. And we focused on two main areas just to kind of keep it an achievable task. Namely, we looked at the changes in directors and also the changes in ultimate beneficial owners. And we kept it to these main areas because these typically generate the most downstream effort. Because most clients we deal with, if they get a new director or a change in ownership, they're likely to send those on to downstream processes, such as screening for sanctions, PEPs, adverse media, etc. So in that 1 month, we saw over 84,000 companies make a change to their directors. And within these, just over 44,000 companies removed directors. But typically that means no additional risk because they're moving away. So we're not going to concentrate on those today. And then on the other side there, over 55,000 companies added directors. Obviously, there could be some companies that do both. Those circles may overlap. And then of the 55,000 companies that then added some directors, it actually resulted in over 72,000 directors being added. So on average, more than one director is appointed when a business change occurs. So this equates to about 1.25% of the entire UK business universe changing per month, or if we then extrapolate that out, about 15% per year of businesses will experience a director change. But those are the overall figures. Within that UK universe, there is a difference in the size of business. So a huge proportion of UK companies, around 95%, are smaller businesses, with the medium and large making up the remainder. And the types of businesses with the most change typically are the larger ones, whereas the smaller and even into the medium companies, they tend to experience less change. So these rates may go up or down slightly depending on the type of third parties that you are dealing with. And then moving on to beneficial ownership, this does become a little bit more complex. It's a tricky area that our clients often struggle with. So in that same month, just shy of 35,000 companies experienced a change. But as you know, with beneficial ownership, there's often quite a complex chain, and a single change in shareholder of a company can actually then mushroom that out. And then once we extrapolated the chain, that accounted to almost 330,000 new or changed UBOs that came out of that 35,000. And as I mentioned, the beneficial owners are much more complex because these could be direct changes where maybe we're dealing with a small business and the owners are just two individuals and they're the immediate owners of that company. Or they could be indirect changes where they're several layers away from the actual UK company that we triggered the initial change of. And obviously those UBOs, those chains could go anywhere in the world. They're not necessarily going to stay within the UK. So breaking those two scenarios down, just over 66,000 were direct, immediate owner changes, but quite a large proportion, over 263,000, were indirect and were more than one level away from the UK starting company. So we did some analysis on that chain. So why is that important? Well, as I mentioned, the chains can be very, very long. And typically what that means is the further away from the company that generated the change, often the less material that impact can be to your immediate third party. So on the graph here, what this is basically showing is those numbers along the bottom show how far away from the starting company. So a 4 on that bottom axis means the UBO change happened 4 links away from the starting company. So as I mentioned, we could have a UK company, maybe it goes through Germany, through France, Australia, before we actually start to get to the individuals that are behind it. So we can see here there's a bit of a spike at level 2. We often see changes, a lot of the changes quite close to the company, but there's quite a lot of changes. There's quite a plateau there between the kind of 3 and 10. So it is quite common for changes to happen multiple layers away from the business. So getting that visibility of ownership changes is often very tricky in itself. And we can see that there's a sizable portion of changes that happen away from the company you're actually immediately dealing with. And that can be very difficult to keep track of. And as mentioned, the further we go away, typically the less material that change is. So if we try to wrap that up and summarize it, as I said, around about 35,000 companies had a change. That equates to around 0.8% of the entire UK universe per month and just shy of 10% per year. And on average, when a change happens, it introduces just shy of 10, so 9.4 new UBOs that are potential checks that you're going to have to send to sanctions, adverse media, etc. However, the bottom circle there says that when we apply a threshold, so most companies we deal with will typically pick 25%, we can see that starts to filter out a lot of that noise and a lot of those changes. So it brings it down to a little bit more of a manageable level of around 1.4 UBOs added when a change actually occurs. So really, just to kind of recap on pieces that Nikki and Martin have mentioned, obviously the rationale around continuous due diligence is to take just the areas that change rather than repeating across the entire third-party base. And if you're able to achieve that, then there can be really significant cost and resource benefits. And in the study that we did, this could be up to 80% of the hours a team spend, and hence knock on to the costs. So just want to acknowledge that obviously these stats look at just one particular portion, the directors and ownership. There obviously could be other changes, but I think that it helps give a bit of a flavour for how much change we typically see across the business universe, and hopefully that helps inform if you feel your team's going to be overwhelmed by change, or conversely, whether it means actually picking up just these pieces will really actually save time in the long run. And I'm now going to hand back to Martin, who's going to look at some of the foundational components that are needed.
Thanks very much, Neil. So after hearing all of the advantages and return on investment which can be obtained by following a perpetual KYC methodology, you may be asking yourselves, why isn't everyone doing this already? Well, it does require a lot of components to be in place to achieve this. And depending on your organization and structure, some of these pieces might be easier to align on than others, which may be slightly more complex. So I've put together this diagram you can see on the screen, which talks about the various different tiers that form the foundation of a perpetual KYC methodology. And starting at the bottom of the pyramid, you can see that a good data strategy forms a solid foundation on which a perpetual KYC process is built upon. We often see companies that have vast amounts of siloed data with all of their own definitions and standards being utilized. Aligning internal systems and creating a unified approach to data ingestion so that you can have a single source of the truth will go a long way in creating a solid foundation for data. And moving up to the next tier on the pyramid, having a clear policy that is able to be digitized and rule-based can also improve the outcomes of a switch to perpetual KYC. Departments may not be able to fully align on a policy and procedure straight away, but looking at small wins and building on these to standardize policy and procedure over time may help. We have also found that those who set out clear, practical, and easy to understand guidance and materials have better results than those who do not. Driving engagement can also really help in this particular area. The third tier up from the bottom deals with workflow. Nikki will be covering this piece a little bit more detail later in the presentation, so I won't dwell on this for too long. However, essentially, this component would direct and channel the activity and processes and procedures that will be taken into account for the workflow, making it easier and clearer for companies like Certa to build and code for those particular aspects. This tier also allows for automation, particularly in regard to menial tasks, which will allow staff to concentrate on those higher value pieces of work. Building on from this, you can see that we are moving to the monitoring tier. You also need to take into consideration internal systems and external vendors who have the ability to produce and monitor the changes, plus the ability to consume the constant streams of data that may be created. All of this should link back to the data strategy and have the ability to receive triggers and alerts on key attributes that are important to your organization. Workflow systems which are in place should also have the ability to feed these alert triggers back through the existing automation process to assess any potential impact. Last but not least, we still need a team to be available to adjudicate and make decisions on this data. As was discussed in Nikki's slides earlier in the presentation, this won't eliminate all manual efforts, but it'll streamline it and enable it to be targeted where it is needed rather than spending time where there's little or no change. I'll now pass back to Neil to discuss the data strategy component in further detail.
Thanks, Martin. So in terms of that data strategy, a lot really depends on core master data management principles. And these are often very easy to say, but in reality, we know this is probably the biggest problem that our clients face, and it's harder to achieve because a lot of organizations do have some tech debt and legacy infrastructure that is quite hard to unravel. But really, we should be looking at trying to reduce those data silos and condense them down into one single source of truth where we keep all the information rather than having it split across multiple systems. And also, when thinking about how to store that data, we need to aim for an architecture and a data structure that's flexible. So for instance, try to capture the underlying data as well as the actual particular outcome or metric that you're trying to derive from that. So as an example, you may use 25% as your threshold of ownership for beneficial ownership. But if you collect and store all the information that's available, then if you choose to change that threshold later, maybe for certain higher risk third parties, you want to go down to 10%, for example, then you don't have to remediate and go and pull all that data again. And the reality is that regulation is only likely to increase. So capture the base data and then try to draw a conclusion or answer a question from it, rather than just looking to capture the answer only. Because if you're able to do that, it just makes it more future-proof. You can leverage the information you've already got potentially to derive a new decision. Also, if your intention is to automate, which is kind of core components to this perpetual due diligence, then we have to really avoid manual processes and collection wherever possible. Now, we do understand that putting a team in and some bodies on seats can often get a compliance program off the ground quickly, but it's then inherently difficult to scale and automate that as the volumes start to increase. So we'd really advocate looking at data sources and inputs that allow an API option. So that basically means the system can connect to the information source, query it, and collect that information without having a human in the loop manually going to a website, pulling information and entering it. And finally, if we are aspiring to that continuous due diligence, then you need to look for sources or a data provider such as D&B that can actually then proactively push those alerts and changes to you. Because as we've seen from the earlier slides and the ROI, lots of businesses actually don't make that many changes, but you have to understand which ones are. So you do need to be alerted to the ones that do. So a data provider that enables that is a must. And just talking back to the pyramid that Martin mentioned, typically what happens, if you do a good job of the data strategy, then the monitoring effectively, you almost get 2 for 1, because most systems where you have an API approach will allow you to automate and start to get changes. So it really helps you with the latter parts of that pyramid. And then moving on to those latter parts of the pyramid, I'm now going to hand over to Nikki, who's going to concentrate on the policy and workflow aspects.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Okay, so in this this section, we will just look at the policy and workflow piece. And as Neil said, there are many changes that go on, and with legislation and just different policies within the business that really starts to have implications for the workflow, which is why we've put these two together. Really what you're aiming for is that ability to apply a rules-based risk assessment approach with your third parties, and that ability to really direct the flow and next steps based on the data that's incoming as well. So really, when you think about, again, a business and the technical debt that they actually have in place, this actually starts to become more of a complex way of working. Being able to cater for the changes that are coming through in the context of different systems and maybe very well embedded mature systems that are not able to flex can really start to impinge the progress of these programs and that ability to automate. So what you'll see next is some examples of approaches that the new technology and the new, for instance, adopting of AI can start to really address some of the bottlenecks in systems in what can be a very complex scenario from a systems perspective. Now, the way that we work is to be able to either support just looking at bottlenecks. We can process, orchestrate across those workflows that are already in place, or replace systems. So what I'm going to do is just take you through a couple of examples of how Certa helps in these examples. Okay, the first one relating to policies. As you know, we've got regulations coming in all the time. You might work in different jurisdictions. You need to be able to really kind of have policies that outline your approach to due diligence and your code of conduct, etc. The ultimate is to be able to standardize those policies across the different business units. And again, in a global environment, that's not always easy. But also what you're aiming to do is give that clear guidance for the majority of situations. However, you get a new regulation come in, and all of a sudden it might have implications for your contract clauses. You need to do a wholesale review of your contracts. It may mean that actually some of your risk appetite needs to change in line with new regulations that come in. Different classifications need to happen, or implications for your monitoring cadences. So again, this is all about this automation and the kind of always on approach to due diligence. If you need to, in this example that you're seeing on screen, make a change because a new regulations come in, where the technology and the AI can help now is to be able to take that regulation and actually take that through into the workflow process and actually identify the areas that need to change according to that regulatory change. And then if you have it set up in the back end, it's able to flow through and actually incorporate that into the existing workflow process. Now, this is AI, it's new, and also you have the context of existing technology that's in place already. There are ways that we can work with businesses that are interested in these sorts of areas and how this could work for them. What you're able to do, if I move on from an adjudication perspective, and again, just another use case that Certa is applying AI to, is if you think about a typical adjudication process, And you saw it earlier, changes happen, and then the adjudicator is assigned a case that requires that adjudication. And that might be based on that flagged transaction. It could be a third-party risk assessment that's happened, vendor onboarding application, or a compliance check. What will need to happen is they will verify that accuracy and completeness of that provided data. And typically it is a case of going to different teams, cross-referencing with internal databases, third-party reports, and sources such as Dun & Bradstreet. So really what you'll see is there's a variety of different sources that need to be checked against. And then what they need to do is to compare the case details against internal policies and the regulatory requirement and compliance standards. And once they've done all of that, what then happens is they need to apply the organisation decision criteria to the case, which might include things like risk thresholds, compliance requirements, and business priorities. So there's a lot going on there within the current way of working, which is quite manual, quite time consuming, relies on different systems and different people in those processes. So what I'm going to take you through now is really a way that CERTA has been helping some of its clients, which is again a move towards that automation, taking AI into account. Now, again, AI is not, the maturity for some businesses is not there to adopt AI, so you can switch it off. But the way that some of our clients are starting to apply this, when you think about the due diligence and using the screening providers, one of the things that we hear a lot about is the amount of false positives that come through. So actually where AI can help is to suggest adjudications based on names, address details, country, state, postcode, etc. Categories, things like date of birth, date of incorporation, and make a rationale for each suggestion that the AI has made. And what we're finding is actually with our tests with our clients is the manual work in these processes can be reduced by more than 75%. So some of the ways that this can help is things like being able to bulk adjudicate. You can have real-time web cross-referencing, again, with the likes of Dun & Bradstreet, with other third-party providers. And actually what it can do is to screen and actually flag up where the false positives are in this process. So the example you can see on the screen, what the system is saying is it doesn't match with the screened entity because the entity name is different. So the AI is actually doing that work that typically the teams are having to do to go through big lists of false positives. So this is actually really reducing that amount of time and also giving you that audit trail that you need as well for justification. So everything is audited. You have that ability to then go through, check. And also, we talked earlier about risk appetite policies. What you're able to do with this approach is have your custom policies and rationales baked into the system so that it's actually assessing against your own risk appetite, against your own policies, to ensure that every decision aligns with your organizational policy. You can even have it set to auto review on low risk categories. So there's lots of different options there that was really designed to speed up these processes. So again, you can see here, it will tell you where CERTA has answered the question. It will streamline that process and give you the rationales and really give you, so a match score in this example, it's 92%. So it's actually really starting to highlight some of the areas that you need to really zone in on, again, to save your team's time. And then with AI, we always have that human element. So the human step in the process. Again, your team can just then take the output, assess it, and okay it, or do whatever they need to do to then take that forward. The final bit with this is that you can, if you wanted to, create that continuous improvement loop. So you can opt in for AI learning, which will learn based on your adjudication outcomes to refine and enhance future decision making. So this is really where we're seeing more of the automation within the systems and the ability for AI to really have a positive impact on some of the manual processes that we are finding teams are spending far too much time in. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to Neil to close out. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Also, thanks to Martin for their input. So we'll try and summarise the main points that we've gone through. We've covered a lot of ground, I think. And what we're tending to hear now is that compliance functions are increasingly being asked to do more. There are new regulations coming in, the best practices are evolving, and also the expectation level of supervisors or regulators is getting higher. So it's a constantly moving landscape. And I think with that, continuous due diligence brings a lot of benefits. It enables you to be at the forefront of compliance with real-time monitoring and the ability to proactively manage risk. It helps you out, as well as standing you well in good stead for respond to new regulations and requirements. And that really was actually something that was highlighted with the Russia-Ukraine situation. Some of our clients that were kind of in this flow when new sanctions lists were released, the system actually just continued as business as usual because the feeds were coming in, they were automatically processing it. Whereas some other clients were a little bit more on the back foot and said, actually, we've not really kept our ownership or director or business information up to date. And suddenly they felt a bit more exposed. And we had a flurry of clients asking to refresh the data effectively to try and figure out if they were going to be exposed. But that continuous due diligence approach, some clients, it effectively was just managed. And alongside, obviously, that risk mitigation, it can mean improved operational efficiency. So resources can spend their time being risk managers rather than risk administrators. And it frees up their time to look at the areas that need the most attention rather than those time-consuming tasks of collecting documentation and system entry. And as Nikki's just shown, AI can be included on top of this to help with that even further. And I think having a good framework and data-driven decisions also means that you can conduct analysis and start to compare what you've got to your risk appetite and then make tweaks and changes. If that's being done on a manual process, then first of all, you may have some fluctuations in the risk assessment because we've got manual operators and some subjectivity. And also then it can be a little more difficult to then tweak whether you want to be more risk averse or open things up. Because again, you've kind of got to get those manual operators used to that new risk-based appetite and adopt it. But if you can get it right, it can be a competitive advantage. Both consumers and businesses have increased expectations these days about everything being frictionless. So the more streamlined, the more easy you can make that due diligence. And as Nikki said, not sending them a generic 100-page questionnaire and rather just giving them the pieces they need or even pre-filling it, then you can often get better engagement. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the webinar and found the material useful. And we do have some time for Q&A. As mentioned, you can type those questions into the toolbar and we'll take a look. So I'm just going to look at the questions that we've got in so far. And the first one we've got in from Bradley says, with demonstrating these solutions at a pre-sales level, what are the most prominent objections from your prospects? Is it cost and budget? Is it legacy tech? Or number 3, availability of staff in that business? So I think maybe I'll take a stab at that and then might ask you, Nikki, because I think you will obviously encounter this. It's a really good question. And I think from our perspective, a common challenge we see is around the screening. A lot of banks and a lot of large institutions decided to put that in like a central service center or center of excellence. And I think what that meant is that certain teams didn't have control over the end-to-end process. Effectively, it got handed off to another team, and they had to wait for them to do their kind of sanctions and PEPs checks, etc., and bring it back. I think that has been a big challenge we've seen, because it's a cultural change. You're having to unpick people that have built up their systems and their processes. And I've seen that some organizations, rather than trying to re-engineer, have actually just built a brand new lab, kind of like digital lab approach, where they've almost just completely started from scratch, built a new straight through process, and rather than switch over, what we've seen some of our clients do is start to siphon off. Maybe at the start it'll be 5% of all pieces of due diligence come in, get sent down that new process, and they test and learn and see how efficient that can be, and then start to move more and more over as they scale that up. But Nikki, I also wonder what your views are, because I guess CERTA, obviously you cover a lot of different parts of risk. I guess, have you seen similar or different challenges?
Yeah, I think the challenges that we're seeing is to point number 2 there. There's a lot of legacy tech that's in place as well, and I think for us it's a case of the business that we're speaking with, where the order of priorities are, what that technical debt looks like, maturity in approach, can be some of the, I suppose, objections. Not necessarily, because I think actually most businesses that we speak to can see that the automation piece is really the way that the market's going, and we've been talking about this in through the lens of KYC and that side of it. But actually, and this might be answering some of the other question that's in the chat, is actually you can take that approach with the other risk domains as well, right? So you can incorporate risk rating providers from a cybersecurity perspective, or bringing in ESG data and monitoring across those different risk domains as well. So actually, when you're talking about a system that's then having that ability to do this continuous monitoring across many risk domains, it can become a complex project, right? It's not something that is going to be done in an organization that has existing systems in place and has done for many years. However, what we're seeing is, and I think this is what you're talking about, Neil, as well, what we're seeing is that ability to look at where bottlenecks are and pick off some of those just using some of the new technology. Some businesses are open to process orchestration and saying, okay, this legacy tech is not coming out, it just won't. But what we want to do is actually put a layer over that is the kind of front door and does all of that data aggregation. It provides one place for our users to go and for our third parties to interact with, and smooths out that engagement piece, and then all of the other stuff can go on behind the scenes. So there's that. And then the other is that we work with some clients who are looking at running POCs, running a POC on a particular area of the program, and then making a roadmap approach to the project, which will then over time start to look at that. So I think it just depends on the client that we're speaking with and the levels of maturity, size of business, etc.
Brilliant, thanks, Nikki. And then I guess also just looking at your number 3 there, Brad, in the options, you mentioned the availability of staff as well. Might just elaborate on that, because as you said, Nikki, I think we see two very distinct scenarios. We see the regulated companies that typically do have a lot of staff. There can be hundreds and hundreds of people offshore, etc., often doing the menial tasks. So there's that cultural issue there of what does that mean? But again, I think it's about directing those resources to doing higher value tasks, not necessarily getting rid of them. It's just making them more effective. And then I'll almost say on the flip side, we're increasingly engaging with clients at the beginning of the process, and I'd say that they have pros and cons. The pros are they don't have legacy tech debt, like you mentioned. So actually, for them to just adopt a new system is much easier because they're not ripping anything out. But conversely, I've often seen those compliance teams under-resourced, and that's where we've had to say, well, you really need to look at automation and AI, because we've talked to lots of teams where maybe it's been put into kind of the legal counsel and they've made a decision and they're trying to operationalize something, but they're not an operational team. And really, if you don't have high levels of automation around the false positives, then if you've not got the staff and those hundreds of people, then you really need a system that's going to do a good chunk of that work. Otherwise, you're going to drown in the alerts effectively.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually though that question from you, Brad, has overlapped a couple of the other questions really around those cultural changes within the business. And Nikki, I think also the question there about having all the different facets of risk in the same system. And I guess maybe a question to you on that, Nikki, is that a trend you're seeing? I mean, we're hearing of lots of clients saying now, obviously ESG sustainability is coming in. That seems to be a big thing on people's minds. Is that something that you're also seeing?
Similar with the regulatory drivers, you've got CSRD coming in, CS triple D, really putting the lens into other areas of due diligence, modern slavery, ESG agenda. So again, these are all different risk domains that when you think about a workflow process really should be incorporated in. Because if a third party is, they're doing really, really well in one risk domain and you're assessing it over there in a silo, but actually, and you think everything's great, but actually over here, the risk domain is really, really bad. If you're not joining that up, then you haven't really got a sense of what the risk of that third party is to the business, because you've got no way of kind of joining up that data and looking at the aggregated risk. So absolutely bringing it together is where we're seeing most of the mature organizations really moving, making a move towards that approach.
Yeah, and Martin, obviously, at D&B, you're often the one dealing with the vast majority of our clients. Have you got any views on that, the challenges and the areas of opportunity?
Yeah, I tend to agree with what Nikki and yourself have said previously. I think it's that how do you move an organization that may have legacy tech, may have teams that are embedded in a certain process or system, to get to where that end goal may be. And as Nikki was mentioning, POC is often the way to do that, show the improvement, but in iterative steps. Don't run before you can walk, I think is the saying that often is used in this sort of area. Making sure that you can really show some success stories in small bits that you can then start to proving to the board and other stakeholders that what you are doing is the right way forward, and that companies like Certa, like Dun & Bradstreet, can then really add value to the organization. And I think promoting that will get more buy-in from others around the organization, almost wanting you to be involved in that sort of type of process, that you, and seeing what you can bring to the table in their parts of the business to streamline their sort of current processes and bits of work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Martin. Just looking, I don't think there's any more questions in the chat at the moment, so I think we are nearing time anyway. So if no one types in the next few seconds, then I think we'll bring the webinar to a close. So just want to say thank you, obviously, to Martin and Nikki for your views, and hopefully you attending the webinar today found this useful and maybe gave you some material to take back into your business if you're facing similar challenges, and help you move forward to try and achieve the utopia that is perpetual due diligence. So thanks everyone. Thanks Martin. Thanks Nikki.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.